All right, let's get right into it. During the absolute peak of the Cold War, the space race wasn't just about rockets and science. It was a full-blown ideological battle. But underneath all the ticker tape parades and celebrated victories, a really chilling legend started to grow. It's a story of voices lost in the void, and a superpower that might have been willing to erase its own heroes just to win.
Just imagine hearing that. A panicked voice, speaking Russian, supposedly broadcasting from orbit, describing the last terrifying moments of her life. This recording, and a few others just like it, are the heart of one of the most persistent and unsettling conspiracy theories of the entire space age.
So what exactly are we talking about here? Well, this whole thing is known as the legend of the ghost cosmonauts. The core idea is simple, but it's also absolutely horrifying. It's the theory that Yuri Gagarin wasn't actually the first man in space. He was just the first one to make it back alive. The legend claims there's a secret history of catastrophic failures, of lost men and women, all deliberately buried by the Soviet government to project this image of perfect, flawless success. And the story starts in a really unexpected place. Not in some CIA listening post or a secret government bunker, but in a home-made radio station in Turin, Italy. Two brothers, Achille and Giovanni Judica-Cordiglia, used some old surplus military gear to listen in on the cosmos, and they claimed that they basically stumbled upon the Soviet space program's private secret hotline. And the recordings they said they captured? Well, they quickly became the stuff of legend. Let's really get into the so-called evidence that they brought forward. The brothers laid out this timeline of terror. First, in November 1960, they say they picked up a faint SOS signal from a craft that was drifting way off course. Then, just 2 months before Gagarin's famous flight, they recorded what sounds like a human heartbeat, fading away, followed by gasps. And then, a month after Gagarin's success, that panicked woman's voice, talking about a fire in her capsule. This whole timeline was a direct challenge to the official story the Soviets were telling the world. I mean, if these recordings were real, they weren't just random signals. They were eulogies. They were the last words of pilots whose sacrifices were totally denied, whose very existence was just wiped from the public record, all for the sake of propaganda. So you have to ask, why would anyone even believe a story this wild? Well, the truth is, the Soviet Union itself created the perfect environment for a conspiracy theory like this to grow. Their obsession with secrecy was just legendary. There were a few key things that really made this whole theory feel plausible. First, you had these official photos of cosmonaut candidates. And then, in later versions of the same photos, guys would just be missing, airbrushed right out of history. Second, Western listening posts would pick up launches that the Soviets would later call unmanned satellite tests, which made a lot of people suspicious. And probably most damning of all, the confirmed tragic death of cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov in 1967 proved that, yes, the Soviets absolutely were willing to send people up in spacecraft they knew were dangerously flawed. And if you want a perfect example of this secrecy, look no further than the case of Valentin Bondarenko. He was a young cosmonaut in training who died in this horrific fire inside a high-pressure oxygen chamber during a ground test. It was a terrible accident, but instead of just acknowledging it, the Soviets completely erased him. 20 years. For 2 decades, the world had no idea that Valentin Bondarenko had ever existed, let alone died serving the space program. So you have to wonder, if they'd hide a death on the ground for that long, what would they be willing to hide from space? Okay, so the story is incredibly compelling, and the historical context, it makes sense. But that is not the end of this story, not even close. It's time to pivot and really put the evidence itself under the microscope. This is where we have to ask the really hard questions. Are these chilling recordings what they actually claim to be? Because as investigators and historians started digging into the technical side of things, the story started to look a little shaky. Skeptics really broke it all down, piece by piece. First, there's the physics. Experts argue that the brothers' amateur radio setup just wasn't powerful enough to track a tiny spacecraft across its entire orbit. It would have been nearly impossible. Second, the language itself. Russian linguists have pointed out that the speech on the recordings has grammatical mistakes and weird phrasing that a native-speaking, highly trained cosmonaut would be really unlikely to make. And finally, the archives. After the Soviet Union fell, the secret files were opened up. Historians found tons of scandals and cover-ups, but not a single document that confirmed a cosmonaut died in orbit before Gagarin. So, in the end, the one place where the proof really should have been hiding in the Soviets' own secret records, it came up totally empty. They found proof of Bondarenko's hidden death on the ground, sure, but nothing to support the idea of these ghost cosmonauts. So if the evidence is so weak, why are we still talking about this? Why does this story just refuse to die? Well, the answer seems to have a lot less to do with facts and a lot more to do with fear.
The legend of the ghost cosmonauts lives on because it's basically a perfect horror story for the modern age. It's not a ghost story about some old haunted house on a hill. It's a ghost story where the haunted house is the infinite, cold, silent vacuum of space.
And this right here gets to the absolute core of why it's so compelling. The ultimate nightmare in this story isn't just dying. It's dying completely alone, millions of miles away from anyone and anything you've ever known, while the very government that sent you there just pretends you never even existed. It's the fear of being utterly forgotten. So in the end, whether the recordings are real or not is almost beside the point, isn't it? The legend of the ghost cosmonauts forces us to confront a much bigger question about ourselves, about our fears, and our deep fascination with that final frontier. It really makes you wonder, what other voices might still be out there, lost in the dark, just waiting to be heard?